So, welcome everyone to the third round. We're at third round now. Third round of the NZIER National Schools Debating. Woo! So exciting. Okay, let's go around the room and let's, I want to know your names, if you're comfortable with it, say your pronouns. So let's start with the first F, please.
Cool. My name's Mia. My pronouns are she, her.
Thank you so much.
Bridget, she, her.
John, he, him.
Guy, he, him.
Valentino, he, him.
I'm Alan, she, her.
Cool. Thank you so much. So, without further ado, if our adjudicators are ready to rumble, are we? Yep, looking ready to rumble. Let's get this show underway. I now invite the first speaker of the affirmative team. Hello, William.
Before we do that, can I grab a couple of chairs? We're very, we're overcrowded in our room. Thanks, buddy. Sorry, Jack, I'll let you get back.
It's okay, So, without further ado, unless Will wants to come, no, he's gone. We invite Samir, the first speaker of the affirmative team, to take the floor. Oh, and just a quick clarification, I'll clap once at 1 minute, once at 7 minutes, and twice at 8 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you. When you're a young black girl who has to sit down at the dinner table with your family, listening to your mother through tears, explaining why you just have to accept the fact that when you get pulled over by a cop, or when you raise your voice to that cop, you're threatened by arrest, or when you tell people that the people that you put the most trust in your government to actually get systemic change have consistently failed to provide any voice towards your oppression amongst like the din of tax breaks or industrialization, we get a massive collapse within our political and democratical system, and we lose the fundamental trust in a system that is promised to protect you. What's our stance in today's debate? Firstly, when we're looking at progressive activists, we're looking like organized bodies like the NAACP, Black Lives Matter lead activists, etc., pushing an advertisement criteria in their marches, etc., about defunding this police. This also looks like people like Joe Biden or Andrew Yang talking at conferences and pledging to defund or mitigate police numbers and or implementing this within power. Note that when this applies to defunding the police, we think it's also very likely for conservative Republicans to come out and advocate for funding the police. We think it's really important that if Nick wants to push that it becomes defund the police versus the status quo, when we implement this policy, we implement discourse. 4 substantive points in today's debate. Firstly, why are candidates incentivized to make this change? Secondly, how do we get more legitimate and constructive change? Thirdly, how does the synergy between the community and police improve? And then a split up, Bridget, on how we get better political engagement and buy-in by minority groups. So let's look at my first substantive point. Why are candidates incentivized to make this change? Because let's look at the characterization of candidates to begin with. Candidates and activists literally rely on public opinion to dictate their agenda. That's what they need to stay in power. The way you do that in engagement with democracy in the US is listening to the symphony of voices that are campaigning for changes in a police course. Why is this discourse dominated by things like defund the police? 4 reasons. First of all, right now, the US stands on a screaming match between the efforts of the police and communities that are disproportionately targeted. This looks like predominantly Latinx communities, African American communities that have been massively oppressed by the power systems of the police. Why is this? This is because police have incredibly large expendable capital, because when you have the latest guns, when you have the latest tasers, police currently have a very high budget, and we don't get security. What we get subjugation, because in poor areas with an incredibly high police presence, when you're carrying guns, you just have the idea that you're largely indestructible versus say like a handgun or a badge. Imagine like like the small petty crimes that are just going to be like happening under their side of the house. We think it's far more important that families and communities like Breonna Taylor, where police are just thinking that guns are the only solution to silence, that's really, really dangerous when all this funding goes into this reliance on guns, and very dangerous when this becomes the only solution. But thirdly, on number, we tell you that police just have very high numbers as predominantly white males, because there's a massive stigma for those in minority communities to join these police groups that they feel as though are the enemy. Well-educated like black men just don't see the incentive into going into these areas either, because they're probably getting offers from loads of other places. But we tell you that there are massive gaping holes in recruitment. It looks like Derek Chauvin literally having multiple offences, but still getting into the police system because it was just a bloated system that they just looked at numbers. We tell you it's far more important that we decrease the numbers. Police are going to want to ensure that they get like more effective police, more effective people, because when you dilute the forces, you want to retain your efficiency by keeping effective people in. This doesn't look like people who have like complaint reports or outdated experience, because that's going to spark further debate on decreasing your quantity. Police forces want to retain their legitimacy. They're going to do this by increasing like public like viewership and public like buy-in when we get better police forces. So what are the impacts of this? 5 things. First of all, we think that like while there's been a massive swell of support recently, that like large piece, like we tell you that minorities like the Latin community, like the black community, like and just the general middle class as well are becoming way more aware and like sympathetic to these movements. We tell you that's like a huge reason why Biden ran part of his campaign. We tell you that candidates are likely to adopt these levels when they now have the opportunity to basically bring in like large amounts of voters who weren't going to engage in the political system because they felt ignored by it. When they don't feel shut out, we bring in all of these people. That's really important for candidates to bring in huge voterships that have otherwise been lost. But secondly, on the sunk harm, we just think polarization within voters is just going to occur on either side of the house. In the same way, like not everyone's going to vote, like not every liberal agrees to defund the police. Like not every pro-lifer just votes for Trump. We just tell you if they want to bring that. Like at the worst case scenario, we still get discourse, we still get attention. That's really important for a few reasons. What are these reasons? So we tell you that when we push people with the capability for power and change in the systems, they actually have the power to implement them. We tell you that it can't be dismissed, or at the very least gets recognized. This looks like people in like affluent, largely sheltered communities now becoming more aware that, oh, like Joe Biden is talking about this, maybe I should pay attention. Or, oh, like this needs to get pushed up from the bottom of the policy agenda list further to the top, because a lot of people actually care about it and bank their presidential candidacy on it. Let's look at my second substantive point on why we think that because now that presidential or like candidates don't want to risk crucifixion by the public, therefore are going to buy into these like really important incentives we told you. Why is it that we're likely to achieve defunding and decrease the number? Because the way you get structural change is going to those with power to change it and knowledgeable in its mechanisms. Because now when Kamala Harris comes and seen as an incredibly legitimate voice, like conservative Republicans can't just dismiss like Black Rights Motors as like extreme agitators or vigilante justice, etc. When you actually have nuanced political discourse with credible people within parliament, that doesn't give you the credibility to just cut them off. Instead, we have recognized legitimate means. That's really, really important for structural change to occur on our side of the house. Let's just quickly look at my third substantive point on the synergy between the police and community. Because note that now there's a massive discord between police and minority communities. This looks like heavy stereotype and often danger to people's freedoms, their movement, and their security. That's really harmful when we acknowledge that the police has a massive imbalance. It's really important to redistribute some of this power back to the community that it's been taken away from. I'll take a POI.
Why are moderate reforms like body cams, which are more palatable to the public, not acceptable in this debate?
We think like things like body cams, things like taking away like more tasers, rifles, etc. We're happy to stand for that. When we look at defunding the police, we think like actually they're going to be more prioritized things like providing better training, because that's going to get public more interested. We think like we're happy to stand for things like body cams, etc. We're telling you we're not happy to stand for like excessive buying of military weapons or sort of like massive numbers of incompetent people. So let's just refer back to that to the point on the synergy of the police and community, because we just want to note that the US has like massive, like the largest incarceration rates per capita. An overwhelming number of these are just for non-violent crimes. So why do we get better synergy and like less targetization of these petty crimes? First of all, we think that when people in power become more engaged in these solutions, as we've told you, we implement better policy through like more legitimate means. We're taking away like unnecessary police force in like urban Chicago, for example, that's really really, really impactful for a few reasons. Because firstly, we tell you that we're way likely to get better cops. We tell you that looks like people with clear records. That looks like people who are more divorced with progressive ideals. That's really good because when you feel more safe and not targeted when you don't have massive expendable police force, or people who you're seeing police coming by your house every day, or pulling out a gun when you have to explain why that parking ticket was undeservable. We tell you that it's far better to get the sophisticated analysis and buy-in from our side of the house, which is really important for society to rise above the din of gunshots and silence and instead promote political discourse and minority weigh-in.
Thanks so much for that speech, Samir. I now invite, if it's okay with the adjudicators, we're ready to rumble. Yep. I invite the first speaker of the negating team, Guy, up to the floor. Take the floor.
The way you get racial justice in America is not to fire hundreds of thousands of police officers telling them that they're like uncontrovertibly racist and beyond repair. What we should do is push for moderate reforms, things like body cams, things like sensitivity training that can actually benefit these people of color on the ground and are acceptable to political discourse, which we actually think we can get. What's our stance in this debate today? Two things. Firstly, we're obviously not going to campaign for things like defunding on their side, but we're still happy to be critical of the police force where this stuff's gone wrong, like in the George Floyd instances, for example. Secondly, we're in place for this. We're going to implement other programs of reducing police violence. This looks like things like body cams. This looks like things like de-escalation training, like having more racial diversity in hiring and trying to appeal to these minority communities. And finally, just like competence testing, we don't think we have to stand for Derek Chauvin in this debate. Crucially, notice that they can't get any of those reforms on their side because these are new initiatives that require a lot of resources to actually get. When you're massively defunding the police and you're stressing them, they're not going to be able to start new initiatives around sensitivity. They're not going to be able to purchase body cams. You only get that on our side of the house. Three arguments in today's debate. Firstly, about how we prevent moderate reform. Secondly, just why defunding the police, even if they are successful, is a bad idea. And Valentino will split to you on how we're going to get a splintering of the progressive movement. And in order to win this debate today, we're going to show you how we're going to improve policing in a meaningful way for these people on the ground. But before we get into that, some rebuttal. They wanted to tell us that there's a widespread support for defunding the police in society. We just tell you this is uncontrovertibly wrong. Why is this? Half of America voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, but even in the Democrats, where this would be more palatable, they literally chose in the primaries the most conservative, one of the more conservative candidates, Joe Biden. They weren't going for Bernie Sanders and his agenda of defunding the police. What we tell you there is support for is things like common sense things, like de-escalation training, like body cams that you only got on our side of the house. Okay. Now they also had this big idea that the people are going, people of color are really scared on the ground, and we accept this, but we tell you that what this debate is about is not just oh, the police are making these people scared, therefore abolish the police. We're going to tell you how we actually improve that policing, improve that relationship in a way that's really meaningful. They want to tell us that the police are really bloated and there's lots of resources. We just tell you that this is fundamentally not the case. Why is this? There's huge incentives for local boards and councils to put a cap on police funding, because there's things rates are incredibly unpopular. There's big programs here. We don't think these police officers are just going around with all these really high-tech technology. They wanted to tell us about like the only white police officers. 2 responses. Firstly, we're just going to tell you that we create a better environment for like joining, because the police is not like diametrically opposed with the Black Lives Matter movement anymore. So you're able to get more black people in the police. But like secondly, we just tell you at the point at which these resources are cut, the like staff cut are likely going to be like younger, like more liberal, and like people of color on that like foundational level. Finally, they just want to tell us that polarization is the same on both sides of the house. We tell you that it can get worse. We're like actually trying to address this polarization and not just accept this. Now onto this first argument about how they prevent moderate police reform. The starting point for this is there's a wide degree of support for moderate police reform for 2 reasons. Firstly, we just tell you things like polling, things like 80% of like Americans like accepting that like body cams should be on is really important. You don't get that with defunding the police. But secondly, we tell you that police accountability is pretty non-political, like in a way that like saying defund the police isn't, because like even Republicans can't be like even Republicans have to stand for things like police doing their jobs well. We tell you that that's non-partisan. 6 reasons why they don't get moderate reform. Firstly, this feeds into conservative narratives about like crazy leftists who aren't able to like want a free-for-all society and want no law and order. That's really powerful because they're not able to get like these like leftist candidates in power as much and actually implement these moderate reforms and this moderate agenda. Secondly, we tell you that the movement is going to be perceived as extreme. Like just because you don't want to defund the police, people are necessarily going to switch off and not want to engage with like these these things. That's really bad because on an individual level, it looks like, oh, your white soccer mom in like Iowa, like just like completely rejecting these ideas and not even like researching about like body cams and stuff. But like in Washington, there's a huge stigma against collaborating now because you're seen as like someone who wants to defund the police if you're a Republican who crosses the aisle. Thirdly, we tell you that there's going to be infighting within this movement, and that's really bad because it's like different bases. That like means that you're not going to like the alternative on the left is not going to be seen as something that's cohesive, as something that's proper. That's what we saw. It was really harmful and the primaries. Fourthly, we just tell you about things like media sensationalization. They have an incentive to make it seem like these crazy leftists are doing crazy things. They're going to do that at the point at which you promote this as your main policy platform. Crucially here, additionally, like police officers are going to be unwilling to implement these changes on like these more moderate changes on the ground on their side of the house because they're being told that you should be like, sure, we're giving you a body cam now, but we're going to fire you tomorrow. You need that buy-in from the police in order to get that reform. That's really important. Finally, we just tell you there's a limited time in the media to discuss progressive issues. We'd rather discuss things that are actually actionable, can actually impact people on the ground. What are outcomes from this? 2 things. Firstly, on a local level, you like get less votes for progressive ideas. This impacts all things, so things like abortion as well. Secondly, and you need that buy-in and that wide support rather than just those radicals. Secondly, just in Washington, there's less bipartisanship, you're less able to collaborate on legislation. I'll take a POI.
Given that most of your point rests upon palatability, don't you think it's far more important to actually get change that it comes from elected Democrats, e.g. Kamala Harris, than rioters on the streets advocating for decentralizing police?
Okay, we tell you that these rioters are going to be emboldened at the point at which the Kamala Harris is literally saying you're good, go out, your agenda is really good. We tell you that it's much more moderate to have common sense reforms around policing rather than just say let's fire all these police officers, let's not give them any more money. Okay, now on why defunding the police is a really bad idea. Starting point, policing is really important for society, 3 reasons. Firstly, just the stability it provides, the law and order, private property, allows people to go about their lives. Secondly, it's really ingrained, we have big police culture within the US, and that's really important because of things like unions. But thirdly, in places where there's natural disasters relief and in these extreme circumstances, the police is a really good mechanism to come in and to be able to help this. Okay, 5 reasons why defunding the police is a bad idea. Firstly, police just help lower crime rates because they're there to deter and they're there to put criminals in jail. That's really important because it impacts all levels of society, and everyone in the space. Secondly, we just tell you that African Americans are going to be more scared at the point at which they're not interacting with police officers. Why is this? Because they're not able to have those corrective, positive interactions on their side of the house at the point at which they're not going to see those police officers. They're always going to have the idea of the police officer as this terrible person who's going to shoot them. You get no opportunity to correct them. Thirdly, we tell you that this entrenches existing power structures within the police because you're not going to get these bosses of the police stations leaving, these old white conservative men. What you're going to get is the younger generation, the lower levels, the people who are more likely to be liberal, are more likely to be people of color. Fourthly, just on scapegoating, we tell you that these police officers are going to be radicalized at the point at which you tell them that you've lost your job because you're racist and these Black Lives Matter people are really important. That means there's a huge amount of resentment there. And finally, just stress levels, because people aren't going to be properly trained and they're like understaffed, they don't have the right equipment, and they're demonized by the left. What are the outcomes of this? Two things. Firstly, we get like higher crime rates on this side of the house. That's really damaging because it impacts these minorities in particular, but also all levels of society. Secondly, you get worse perception of police, you get less support for minority policy generally, and more racial violence. We oppose.
Thank you so much, Guy, for that. It was a great speech. I'd now like to invite the second speaker of the affirmative team, Bridget.
In a country where minorities combined make up a majority, we on the affirmative side want them to vote. So I'll be discussing how activists and candidates campaigning to defund the police get better buy-in surrounding these minorities. But I will first rebut with two areas of clash coming from Side Nick. So Side Nick came in saying we would have body cams, we would like put money into getting these body cams and kind of using this as to like help deter police. But with like an overwhelming amount of police, right, already, they want to put body cams on every single one of these people. This takes a lot of funding from an area that is already largely funded. And so this just like body cams, and also on that, this was kind of under the changes to police, and the second kind of area of clash was the effectiveness in government. So under the changes to police with the government, with the changes to police with the cameras. So we just think that cameras just do not essentially provide this justice. They might deter someone to stop like killing someone, but it doesn't stop police like over patrolling like these communities, right? Because of prejudice to catch these petty crimes. Like it is known that police over patrol these communities just to catch these crimes, just to throw them in jail. Like this is a known fact. And we think cams, like obviously if you watch a cam of someone catching someone smoking weed or like a petty crime, they like the police can argue, right? Like we need it, like they can argue that that's a legitimate crime, like it is. We think like this just won't deter the actual problem of the overwhelming amount of police in the justice system. And so like kind of on the effectiveness in the government. So they kind of talked about how it would be, these ideals would be perceived as extreme if the government came out and if like a campaigner came out and put it forward. But we just think like, and we responded kind of in a POI, like asked a question on how, like, do you not suppose that like riots would result in worse? Because we see that under their side of the house, we'd see riots where the community doesn't feel represented by the government and feels that they have to take necessary measures to make people heard, right? If you're not heard by the government, what are they going to do to like get themselves heard? So we just think that like the systemic racism that is, and they're gonna do stuff, and it doesn't mean just killing, right? Like the systemic racism isn't just police brutality. It is like, again, the over patrolling. And so like the government doesn't have to stand for these riots, right? They can prevent them by standing for like against these policies and just saying we don't agree with this, and therefore we wouldn't see these riots because people feel heard and people feel represented. And with people where minorities who are affected by the police make up a quite considerable amount of people who are affected by the police, right? We see these in Black people, we see this in Hispanic people, and it just like having body cams just does not fix this at all, right? Because when these riots happen, it actually results in more police brutality from this. Because of riots, right, we've seen these representation of riots, and police have just gotten so aggressive against this, and they've been overwhelming and just completely like smothering on the effects of this. And so kind of moving on to my split point on how we get better buy-in surrounding minorities into politics and campaigns. So we see two reasons as to why this is true. Number one, it is relevant to their life. Number two, knowledgeable discussion. And so kind of, again, bringing on what Mia said, like we've shown that campaigners will have incentive to do this, because even just having Hispanic and Black people voting as they're affected by police, you would have people who would otherwise not vote, right? Because otherwise they were not previously affected. So moving on to the first reason as to why this is true, how candidates and activists campaigning is now relevant to minority lives. So this looks like, again, Black communities, Hispanic communities, just the people who are oppressed by the system. So when these communities are being discussed, when campaigners recognise the issues between them and the police, they feel more inclined to be engaged in this political discussion. So this looks like them not only turning up to rallies, but also voting. Previously, they were unrepresented, but with laws like whether that actually hold value to them. Previously, where the police were bad as a whole, and when we have less police, they become more inclined to engage and vote. So the second reason is how campaigns promote knowledgeable discussion. So this looks like well-educated politicians having contrasting views. So we see pushbacks from each side to prove statistical reasoning, meaning politicians like Trump that spit up blatant lies among minorities, lies against Hispanic people, and all this prejudice that he put, these just like absolute stereotypes can be campaigned and counteracted with facts. Yes.
What's more palatable to Mitch McConnell, like putting some body cams on police or like defunding the entire police system?
Well, we see what is more palatable to him, and when we kind of flip this on its like actual true what would happen, we see that riots are actually less palatable to him. And if the government can realize that riots are really not in their best interest, and they see, okay, maybe we push something that's actually not palatable to the public, but if we can push and say why this isn't palatable, and we can say, look, if we like these aren't palatable, but when we see the kind of result of having government who just don't want to push palatable to be like safe, then we see like these riots happening. And we've kind of proved this, and Mia talked about it as well. And kind of going back onto my second reason, so we like again with the Trump who spits out blatant lies about these communities. And like we see like less buy-in to fundamentally untrue statements, as we now have campaigners who go against him and pressuring the truth. So this looks like not only minorities buying in, but we also see like the general public who may have been swayed by Trump's overwhelming position in politics, now saying, oh, okay, we see actual facts proven by like counteracting evidence. And they kind of get this buy-in to actually vote for these other campaigners. And then we see this less hierarchy of Trump having this absolutist role. And so kind of like bringing this all in, we see on the whole, like minorities now being supported and therefore voting when they otherwise wouldn't. At our worst, we have at least campaigners talking about the police force. Even if we don't get these fundamental changes, even if we don't get these policies, even if we don't get this police police defunding, we actually get people talking about it, right? We get people understanding what is a huge issue and not just seeing riots. Like if you are a person and you are just seeing riots in your community and that is the only thing you see surrounding Black Lives Matter, what is your opinion going to be? If you see these aggressive riots, right, what is your opinion? It is going to be very against those riots because riots are aggressive because they are a last minute chance for people to try and push what they believe in. It is just not like reasonable when we can have campaigners just talking about these, getting discussion and actually helping these communities, right? And so at our worst, we see society addressing the obvious issues like police brutality. This isn't just minorities starting to vote. This is the whole community understanding a huge issue surrounding them. Police affect everybody, right? Yes, we see it negatively affecting minorities, but we see police being a huge part of everyone's life. So we, on the affirmative side, stand for an educated and pro-discussion society. Proud to propose.
That's really fantastic. Now I invite Valentino to take the floor.
This debate is not about whether or not the police are bad. This debate is not about should we actually do anything about it, right? This debate is about what is the correct course of action, right? And that's what they have failed to understand from throughout this entire debate, right? Because we have told you from first, what we support is these politicians and these activists supporting more moderate policies. What they've told you down the line is that the only way that they can actually achieve any form of change is through defunding the police, but they never really tell you why all this change is so exclusive. Well, we have come out and told you why defunding the police is inherently harmful towards the movement, and I'll continue to tell you why change actually occurs on our side, right? So what do we think the issues in this debate are? So first of all, we think it's, does change occur and is it effective? Second of all, how does this affect the movement as a whole in terms of politics and otherwise? And lastly, I'll split showing on how the movement splinters and why this is so harmful, right? So does change occur and is it effective, right? Realize on our side, what we have offered to you is 3 mechanisms as to how we actually get moderate policies passed, right? First of all, we get regulation that's uncontroversial, like body cams, right? We think that generally everyone agrees that in the light of like George Floyd's murder, we need some degree of regulation for these sorts of police forces, right? But second of all, we've told you about less ability for the right wing to actually uniquely point to these groups and claim that they're extreme, right? We see that in light of rioting and protests, we've seen a lot of things like Fox News claiming that BLM is trying to take down America by getting rid of the police force, by throwing the state into anarchy, right? We think this just feeds into that narrative. But lastly, we think that moderate people are just more likely to empathize on our side, right? When we think that these individuals, we don't think that all individuals across the board necessarily support defunding the police, right? We think that there is a lot of contention around this, especially when like people view the police as a necessary part of their society, right? Because we think that when people see crime actively happening and crime rates are still high within America, we think that at that point, you probably see the police as something that's necessary towards the function of society. We think that what this means is on our side, we're actually able to get real change, right? Through things like legislation, be it on the national level or be it on a state level, right? Because first of all, we have the moderates actually voting with us, right? What this means is that at the bare minimum, what we have is within purple states, you see situations where moderates are more likely to vote for state legislators who are willing to put up these moderate policies, right? And we think that this just simply cannot occur under their side when you splinter the movement and make it seem more and more extreme. But also, they try to push onto us this whole idea of like how rioting is inherently going to just like spoil the movement and ruin its image, right? So first of all, recognize that under the status quo, all this rioting has occurred in light of the idea of defunding the police, right? You see these rioters with the signs and all of that, and that's where this whole image has come from, right? That's what Fox News complains about, right? But second of all, we think that it's sort of equivalent on both sides because both sides are trying to fix the problem, right? So when they came up with their whole analysis about, how we stop rioting and therefore improve the image of the movement, we think that we stop rioting too by regulating the police to the point at which they cannot actually actively kill people on a regular basis, right? Which leads into the second point, right? Do we get effective change, right? So simply, what they've come up and told us today is that there's over-policing, the police are all racist, and like there's a lot of problems. And we agree, under the current status quo, there are issues with the policing system. What we need, therefore, is regulation, right? What we've seen within states is situations when when police forces are regulating themselves by putting in place rules where if a police officer does not report on his fellow officer for things like hate crimes, they are therefore complicit, right? We think that occurs. We think there's also things like body cams to hold these officers accountable and things of that nature, right? We think that all this achieves the things because it means that the police officers have to actively think twice, right? No matter how racist they are, they know that there are repercussions, right? They never really tell us why like this doesn't work or why we need to defund the police just to get this, right? They tell you a bit about over-policing and how that's like inherently horrible for these communities. What we tell you is, first of all, while this is problematic, we think that under our side where you actually get things like racial sensitivity training, that's when these communities are more likely to feel comfortable and this changes over time. But also recognize that when they start trying to claim that, we can get all these moderate changes and like racial sensitivity training too, first of all, they recognize we've already told you from first that you like alienate the police officers, right? When you're actively leading to the loss of jobs, when you're actively defunding and lowering their wages, we think you're more likely to have them antagonized. But also thirdly, we think that simply put, we think that in these sorts of scenarios, what you have is a situation where these old racist police officers who are in charge of these sorts of buildings and institutions are just putting in more racist people into like the minimal amount of officers that they're allowed to keep in, right? They never really, and when they try to claim that, oh, but there's like candidate incentive and police force incentive to like not be racist anymore. First of all, they really mischaracterized like what the world looks like, right? They want to claim that minorities are all a majority in this, are suddenly all a majority in this debate when they coalesce, right? First of all, we think that if that really were true, you wouldn't see the problems that you have under the status quo, right? We think that these problems exist because they aren't able to gather enough voter share, enough voting power to actually make all these changes, right? This is why we believe this whole thing about convincing moderates is so important, right? We think that in the modern polarized context, we think these sort of voters are set. What we need a moderate switching over to our side. But second of all, we think that in the case of like police officers fearing more defunding, we think that if they really are defunding the police to the extent that they are like crippling them, we think that they have larger problems in terms of the criminal justice system and whether they actually hold criminals accountable and all these things. Before going, yeah.
Don't you think that it's far more likely for moderate politicians to listen to Nancy Pelosi telling you need to defund the police than loose vigilante groups?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, we don't think Nancy Pelosi is the kind of individual who's going to be talking about defunding the police. We think it's individuals like AOC. We think it's individuals like Bernie Sanders. We think it's going to be individual members who are generally deemed as more radical, right? Because you have to recognize that the left isn't just like one set body, right? There are multiple parts to it, right? We think there's a more moderate side, which is Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, those guys. And then there's also the more radical side. We think what you tap into is ultimately the more radical side of the movement, right? Those are the kind of people who buy into these sorts of things and have actively said these sorts of things in the past. This moves on into my split, right? So how do we think the movement splinters under their side? Realize that what happens on their side is that more moderate BLM supporters who want things like regulation are ultimately alienated, right? We think that this occurs because one, more moderate individuals are disillusioned by the ideas of the funding because like they know that crime exists. But two, the movement doesn't have one set leader under which they all follow, right? The BLM movement has many different institutions and many so-called leaders and many people speaking out about it. But three, also we think that the radical group is incentivized to feed off more anger, to grow up their hate and to justify defunding the police, right? Because you have to justify wanting to take down the institution, right? We think that to that extent, what they create is a situation where we think that no matter how much they try to claim that they can still get moderate policies, moderates are ultimately what you have is a situation where moderates are not going to vote for defunding the police, but also we think that these more radicalized individuals won't even vote for moderate policies because they feel it's insufficient, right? Because when you're constantly told that you have to take down the entire system and that's the only way in which you create change, that's when you don't get any change at all, right? This occurs because of cults of personality. This occurs because all these individuals that they want speaking out actively have an incentive to create a movement that has only one ideal. For all these reasons, we believe that they do not get any change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John Tino. I now invite John to come up and conclude the substantive portion of the affirmative team's case. Woo! John!
The fundamental flaw of the negating side's case today was never whether they get body cams on police men and women, it's whether they actually get effective policy change for minorities, for people who really don't have a voice in society, people who can't be represented in democracy. We tell you, no one's ever going to listen to a vigilante like justice group over someone like a respected politician or someone who is a progressive campaigner. Two clashes for the House then. Firstly, who gets effective political buy-in, and then secondly, who meaningfully improves the lives of minorities. So first, we as the affirmative side of the House can prove we get the more effective political buy-in and we do get effective, like meaningful, constructive policy change, then we win this debate because there's just no way they can come back from like the lives of so many people being improved and police not having like all these brutal acts that they do. What do we see then? We told you at NZIER about the candidates' incentives, how we're not going to get the crucifixion of the public because there's a systemic progressive change in society. They told us to this that just we're never going to get this change. There's too many polarized views, and you're only going to get some change within the police force if you have like a moderate policy such as body cams. They told us that the movement is going to be perceived as too extreme, too radical, so you're not going to get that buy-in. What do we tell you on this? 3 responses. Firstly, the fact that you get media attention is better than like the status quo or the system that they stand for, because the fact is the media attention is going to come from sophisticated politicians or progressive candidates who actually have respect in society, who can meaningfully convince people to actively like change their views and be educated to change and like actively vote for this policy. We tell you it's always going to be more palatable that getting a policy from Joe Biden than from like vigilante rioters. There's always going to be rioters in moderate body cams because there's not going to get the like radical left that they wanted to talk about on their side of the house. Those people are never going to be satisfied, so that they also get riots on their side of the house. Secondly, there's an incentive for minorities that like face this police discrimination. They actually make up like a large proportion of America. We tell you America has lots of like African American people. They have lots of Hispanic people. They have like people from the Middle East. They have so many different people. So all these minorities are going to like face police discrimination. They're going to be incentivized to like vote for this policy, and they're going to get this policy. We tell you it's better that they engage in their democratic right, and actually it's so much better that they have progressive change than like the political ramifications. We tell you 70% of people in America want gun reform. What has happened? Like no gun reform, just because politicians play too much into identity politics and just like cater to the moderate view. It's time we actually take action and like make a social justice decision. Thirdly, and most crucially, even if we don't get this policy change, which I've clearly proven that we do, we still get political discourse, and we still get many conservative and like many Republican people being educated to actually change their views. We think that's so much better than what anything they can have on their side of the house for the moderate view. What did they tell us then? They told us that like staff and resources being cut has extreme conservative conservative and moderate views, and that's really, really harmful. We tell you that Nancy Pelosi is always going to have so much more respect than a vigilante group advocating for social justice. They came back at this and said it was just like too radical, so people aren't going to listen. We tell you there's still going to be radical people, because at the point where George Floyd and like Breonna Taylor have been murdered, there's still going to be people advocating and like rioting for police brutality change. This is not a mutually exclusive harm. Secondly, we tell you that like moderate in America really doesn't exist. There's like, America is so divided. They have such polarized views. We tell you polarization is going to occur equally on either side of the house. We tell you there's like a range of things that happen. There's so many like different human experiences. People just have a range of different political beliefs. You're always not going to appease everyone. And at the point that you don't have that like pleasing everyone, we think it's better that you actually get progressive social change that's going to meaningfully improve the lives of like so many people, and not have people facing police brutality. We think that's so important in this debate. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Is it not easier for Fox News to spin a really conservative, vitriolic narrative about like defunding the police rather than like common sense body cams and sensitivity?
Okay, we think Fox News is kind of bad, and like obviously news coverage in America isn't that good, but we think at the point that you have like news coverage of people actually getting like progressive police change, at least you're getting like viewpoints from either side. You can kind of see the other person's view. What you have is just like a moderate view where they're like, oh yeah, police like body cams on policemen, like that's pretty moderate, that's pretty substandard, nothing much is going to happen, and you don't actually get the like public buy-in that we have on our side of the house, the political discourse that we think is so important. So moving on to who meaningfully improves minorities' quality of life. What did they tell us? They told us, we told you that we get synergy between the police and we have trust between them, and we decrease the minority stereotypes. Firstly, they told us that police were really, really important, and when we defund them, that decreases the stability. We tell you the reality of crime in America isn't like all these super violent crimes. It's so many like petty crimes and non-violent crimes. This looks like people like doing drugs and like dealing weed and that kind of thing, not these the like really not kinds that require stability that they were keen to advocate for on their side of the house. They then told us that like if we defund the police, we're going to be so unsusceptible to like a natural disaster or that kind of thing. Firstly, we still have the capacity to do this on our side of the house. We still think there's going to be enough police people to actively like help people. But secondly, we think it's actually more likely that we get safety for minority people, because at the end of the day, if there's like a natural disaster and you've got all these racist policemen, they're always going to help like the white people more than the minority groups. At the end of the day, even if we get like less safety overall, we think it's better that you uplift minorities because they're at such a vulnerable position in society, and we decrease police brutality. They then said that like they get police brutality decrease also because they have like a moderate body cam. We tell you this is just not true. Polarized views mean that you always get like a bit of repercussions on their side of the house. On our side, you'll get fined and you'll get like cancelled and you'll actually go to jail. You'll face imprisonment for killing a minority person. On their side, all you're going to get is like a bit of buy-in from the public, from the moderate view. At the end of this debate, we are the side that effectively like gets political buy-in from the public. We don't drag down minorities. We actively uplift the minorities and improve their quality of life. We're extremely proud to propose.
Thanks so much, John. I now invite the final substantive speaker of not just the negating team, but this debate, Alan. Take the floor. Go, Alan.
Both sides in today's debate are extremely sympathetic towards the Black people, towards the people of color, towards the minorities who are systemically oppressed by America's dysfunctional police system. What the outcome of this debate hinges on is which side is better able to realistically and practically get the best outcomes for these people in terms of the police system, rather than like the sort of like overarching values which are the same on both sides. How are we going to win today's debate? We're going to win today's debate with the following path to victory. We're going to show you why it's not enough that we're like defunding the police. Secondly, why defunding the police is going to like impede like moderate reforms and stuff, and why this is like going to be really bad, as well as like the unique harms of defunding the police. And separately from that, we're also going to be telling you about why like their side actually actively impedes like political engagement and discourse, which is like better on our side. Those are my 3 points of clash. Firstly, in terms of like moderate reforms, how we get them, why is it important? Secondly, political engagement discourse. Thirdly, what actually happens. Okay, so onto the first point of clash. Firstly, it's important to note here that just by like the way this debate has turned out, it's become like implicitly accepted by both sides that like defunding the police isn't actually important, because most of the material that like Av gave you surrounds like sort of like the discourse that's going to be generated from this, and like the feelings of empowerment that are like given to like Black people and people of color, right? As well as the sort of like tangible outcomes of them actually like getting better safety, which means that if we can prove to you that the moderate reforms that like we're telling you about that are like mutually exclusive actually like fulfill all of these claims better, and they're defunding the police, and that it's mutually exclusive and only exists on our side, we actually win this point of clash. And because it's also like the most important point of clash in the debate, we will also win the whole debate. Okay, so what has the opposition brought to the table? Af has told you that they're like happy to stand by like getting more political reforms, right? So like this is like not true, because like it's mutually exclusive. why is this true? Firstly, like moderate voters are likely going to
On that.
be put off by like progressive policies rather than supporting them if defunding the police is actively campaigned by. We've given you like numerous mechanizations as to why this is true. Like it's unpalatable. The media has like an incentive to like mile all of this, right? And like because the media is like trying to appeal to like a broader voter base, they want to like sort of get clicks from both conservatives and moderates, which means that they're more likely to like lump together all of these progressive policies. We've already told you all of that. Okay, so like we've agreed that like body cams aren't ubiquitous, but like de-escalation training is also like chronically absent, right? Our side is trying to get moderate reforms, including stuff like de-escalation training, including like body cams, including like all of that really good stuff, which we think does cover like saving the lives of people of color and vulnerable Black people, but it also like contributes to like their feelings of safety, which means that at the end of this, we are like these moderate reforms are going to be like sufficient in getting good outcomes. We've also told you that like conservative and moderate politicians are able to like dismiss all of these like moderate policies once like defunding the police is like raised and campaigned by, because it's going to appear like absurd, unfounded, like progressive rhetoric. That's like how the conservative media is incentivized to spin it. That's how conservative politicians incentivize to spin it, which means that like but on top of all of this, we also tell you that like there's going to be like a lot of resentment towards the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like we told you at first that like people seeing like the police being defunded, seeing them reduced in size are going to feel like they're like protectors, like the protectors of their communities have been like stripped from them, right? Like all of these feelings of safety of like your sort of like soccer mom from like Alabama, like this sort of stuff, right? There's going to be a lot of resentment towards the Black Lives Matter movement, which means that police are going to be like more hostile towards Black people. We think it's likely then that we're going to see like far fewer Black police, which means that on our side, we actually get like more diversity in the police force as well. And we think that the sort of like grassroots way through which like police can actually like empathize and like be like have like less systemic racism in that way is actually mutually exclusive on our side as well. So what are the benefits of moderate reforms? Ad has tried to tell you that like body cams aren't enough to like tackle over policing, for instance. So like we tell you now that like the other reforms are like enough, right? All of these moderate reforms together are able to like combine to fix things to make things like much better for Black people and people of color. Secondly, like in their world, the increased resentment towards Black Lives Matter movement and like Black people in general are going to like make things much worse. They're going to like the feelings of fear and stuff are going to spread to them, because not only do they have to like fear from the police who aren't going to like improve under their world because they're still going to be like run by like old white men, but secondly, like all of the sort of like a lot of like civilians might also like have the potential to enact like vigilante harms towards like Black people. They're going to get like a lot of fear because of the heightened resentment. We don't want to impose all of that fear onto them. Opposition also tried to tell you that like riots are unpalatable to the government and right-wingers. 3 responses. Firstly, like riots decrease when moderate reforms are implemented, because we think that like these moderate reforms, by improving the lives of like people of color, are also going to like appease like riots, right? Secondly, like we think rioting also sparks discourse. So like a lot of the material on how like discourse is only achieved when we like campaign for like defunding the police, like that's not true. And finally, like right-wing politicians are able to use rioting as like scapegoat rhetoric to like show why progressive like reforms and ideals aren't like good, which means that like on their side, like the implementation of moderate reforms is going to be further impeded. Okay, so what are the outcomes of this point? We've proven that firstly, like moderate reforms are able to like bring far more to the table, are able to improve their lives tangibly of like Black people far more than like defunding the police, right? And we've also shown that it's mutually exclusive on our side because of everything I've already told you. The outcomes of this are that like all of these moderate reforms gather together to make like life so much safer for like people of color, not only for like their physical lives, but also their feelings of security, like all of those things that opposition wanted to tell you. This is the most important point. So like comparing this to like political engagement and discourse, we think that this is far more important because discourse is only important insofar as it gets change. For us, like for this point, like we get like a far greater scale as well as a far greater severity, because it means that we actively have like change that actually saves lives. We think that's far more important. Second point of clash onto like political engagement and discourse, right? So 3 attacks from AF: more media attention, empowering POCs and minorities, and finally like how they think like Nancy Pelosi or like Biden are going to be implementing these things. Okay, so in terms of like more media attention, right? Like we think that there's already like a lot of organic media attention surrounding like the Black Lives Matter movement. We think there's already like a lot of discourse. We don't think that they're going to be able to like garner that much more discourse, right? In terms of like empowering like people of color and minorities, we think that like people of color, we already see like a lot of organic grassroots movement towards like the increase of empowering them, because like we see this in terms of like George Floyd's like relatives attacking Biden for like not doing enough, right? We think that a lot of this discourse already exists. They're not able to get like very much at all. Like it'll be very, very marginal. And also we don't think it's realistic that Nancy Pelosi or like Biden are going to be speaking out about this, because it's like not in their political interest, right? They're incentivized to appeal to like moderates as well as like leftists or like progressives, because that's what like gets them in power, right? We think that these incentives are acting on them. We don't think it's realistic. So why is it better? Why is discourse like uniquely better on our side? We think that the discrediting that happens towards like leftist ideals as a result of like raising the issue of defunding actually like mars a lot of the progress that leftist like progressive ideals are able to gain. We think that the outcomes therefore are symmetric at best, but like far better on our side at our list. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ellen. And now, as is traditional in New Zealand, this tournament, and I'm told other places as well, we're going to reverse the speaking order. So the negating team will come up for this leaders reply. Who's going to do it?
I will.
That's exciting. Woo!
It's crucial to note in this debate that all of affirmative's material about getting more political discourse about defunding the police is entirely contingent on that being a positive policy for these minorities on the ground. We say that if it's a discussion about a policy that's not going to help them, we'd rather have that discussion, not have that discussion, and be able to focus on other issues like affirmative action, issues like abortion reform that are actually going to help these people in this debate. Two questions here. Firstly, and most importantly, on policing outcomes, and secondly, on political discourse. We've told you down the line about how police are always going to be preferable to more police. We've told you about how they discourage crime by virtue of them being there and like they get the criminals off their streets. The only response we got to this was mitigatory and saying about, oh, a lot of like crimes now, like drug-related crimes, and they're non-violent. Why is that bad? We tell you already, like with like legalization of things like weed and like there's a move away from policing these types of crimes. This means like, but notice how they still haven't engaged with like violent crimes. Like we still have that on like their side of the house. Like we point to places like Chicago where like violent crimes are really, really prevalent. We don't think it's good enough for them to just assert that like crimes are mostly going to be non-violent. We also tell you that we're still going to get like accountability like for that police force at the point at which they're not really stressed. They are able to get those body cameras on. They are able to get that training. Why is that training so important? Because when you're a police officer who's like, we used to be like, is now doing like the work of 4 police officers because they've all been fired. When you've had no training on like how to like change your own biases, when you had no, and like when you're still like scared of these like minorities because of those biases and you're under extreme stress, that is when you get like people like incidents like George Floyd, incidents like people of color being shot. You're only able to like that happens on their side of the house because that like token police force is still going to be really stressed, really like in this high pressure situation. They wanted to tell us here about how over policing. We just tell you this is going to be like solved by like racial sensitivity training, and it's like often like really important. We've already told you and given you reasons why you can't get that on their side because of the resources that these programs necessarily require. But secondly, we just tell you like you still get like that immense fear, and they're like we'd rather have like a little bit of over policing than none at all. They never responded to our material about how we entrench divides within police because like it's likely to be liberal, young people of color who get fired in this thing, and you're still going to get those like conservative bosses. That's really bad. They lastly wanted to hit about like we needed riots to we're going to get riots on our side of the house. This idea is like completely absurd for a number of reasons. One, we tell you that these Black Lives Matter protesters are like going to be satisfied by a lot of the concessions they like make, and like we're not going to stand by these violent mechanisms. But even if the riots do occur, those are precisely the types of things we're having police say is really important to make sure that it is de-escalated where they do have that training. This is the most important point in this debate today, because what these people and minorities on the ground actually care about, and like these disaffected communities are particularly impacted, but also all of society, like your ability to open a business and not be like scared that your like dairy is going to be robbed. We tell you that's a massive harm. Now in political discourse, they told us that candidates have incentives to appeal to like a large minority of people and would rather have like legitimate figures endorsing this idea. Notice how that's again contingent on that idea being good. We already proved that it isn't. But secondly, we just tell you that Nancy Pelosi, if she really wanted to get like the Latino vote because of this policy, would already be endorsing it. She's like knows that she needs this for her party. They're not, therefore their analysis doesn't like occur. Firstly, we just tell you again that we get more discourse when you're seen as like an interaction between two reasonable sides. They never really wanted to engage with this because like we give them the opportunity, like Fox News, to spin these really disgusting narratives. That's bad. You also like entrench these divides because like police officers now feel really radicalized. They feel really disaffected as a result of these minorities. They're not going to be get that. Okay. So at the end of this point, we can see that we get better political discourse on our side of the house. But at the end of the day, that political discourse doesn't matter if that's not going towards something that's actually going to tangibly improve lives on the ground. Things like body cams, things like sensitivity training. We oppose.
Thanks so much, Guy. We got a message in the chat. Go, Guy. It's exciting from the stream team. Stella McKenzie. It's exciting. Anyway, now we reverse the reversing, and we invite up the leader of the affirmative team.
What we heard from SideNeg today was that we had to accept that racist cops couldn't leave the police force because otherwise they'd be radicalized. Body cams were a palatable solution to solving entrenched power structures with weaponry and incompetency. We tell you that when we pass social justice measures through legitimate means, we get change at best, engagement from political echelons, and trust and validation by minorities at worst. 2 points of clash in today's debate. What legislative is going to be most effective, and secondly, who helps minority communities. So let's look at legislative justice, because both sides were pretty mutually agreeing in that structural change was best achieved through structural means. So SideNeg sort of came out and said we cater to palatability when we get body cams. Just note that like we just tell you that body cams themselves are like very polarized, that like in America there's not really this massive like moderate shift. It's the reason like body cams haven't been heavily implemented. But also like if we just take them at the best, we tell you that body cams are really hard to prosecute, like very nuanced cases of racism that are really dangerous. That we tell you that like with the massive like concentrated strain of police patrol, there's no effect on the body cam, whether you have like the latest, like whether you're decked out in weaponry and machinery, whether you're like over policing certain areas that's really bad for minority groups. That's really dangerous and does nothing really to force the cops, because otherwise, as they told you, we can't get rid of these cops because otherwise they're going to be radicalized. We tell you it's a really great thing that we get rid of racist cops on our side of the house when we decentralize and limit the movements of these. But also we just tell you that we, like the other side that we heard that wasn't exclusive on body cams was things like training programs. We tell you we're also just mutually happy to stand for that as well. That wasn't largely dependent on cost, and something we told you right from F was a symmetric benefit. But let's have a look at the main pushback that we heard from SideNeg. We got this whole point about liberal extremes and this whole case of palatability. We tell you two things. First of all, like when we get structural change, we think it's far more important that this occurs through credible figures. Look, whether this is Joe Biden or AOC, we don't really mind. We think like at any point that we're getting credible figures by notable news sources, bringing these subjects to the Senate, to really important and powerful people that can do it, that's far more better than the silence or the ignorance we get from Fox News, like telling these rioters that they're agitating the state of America and that it's their enemies. We raise policy, agenda, and engagement by people who are more knowledgeable about these things, and we tell you that it's about the people who want to listen to democracy. It's about the recognition by minority groups for the systems that they feel that they've been unfairly treated by. We tell you we get massive benefits on our side of the house when actually like Latinx communities see people like AOC, see people like Bernie Sanders bringing to the Senate really important harms that have just been neglected, or just under the guise that body cams are just going to fix this. We tell you that's really dangerous. But even if all of this fails, we just tell you, firstly, I just want to point out like the numerous mechanisms we told you why candidates are going to be incentivized and why this was a much bigger group about the support for the Black Lives Matter movement than they wanted to tell you. But then we just tell you like even if all else fails, like the polarization is just a massive thing we have to concede with both sides. We tell you that like not all staunch feminists are going to vote for Biden. Polarization is just apparent within like American politics. So with this was also a harm that they had to contend with body cams they try to brush over. But secondly, on minorities, like they just said that minorities are just going to feel a lot better because some cops are now going to wear body cams. Like we tell you on minorities, firstly, very incredibly disengaged from political systems, fear for their lives, their children's lives because of policing and hostility. We tell you that in like at the very little, we get minorities through credible democracies recognizing their plight. That's really important for communal empowerment. But also we tell you that with all our analysis on why politicians were incentivized to make this change, we tell you that defunding the police was really successful and really crucial to deregulating, trigger happy, or the stability of the police, and not sheltering the massive expendability of a police community that continually oppresses and aims to marginalize these people. So proud to propose.
Thank you so much to both teams. I thoroughly enjoyed the debate, and it looks like the adjudicators did too. Thanks to every single one of you. I invite you all to cross the floor, shake hands. If you're not comfortable with that, you can do the elbows, you can do the knees, you can high five. Just give each other a compliment. Either way, thank you all for that debate, and I'll turn the stream team off now as well. Hi, thanks for tuning in to the third episode of the NZIER National Schools Debating Championship. Thanks for tuning in. See ya. Bye.